All right, part two for teams and groups, groups and teams, teams and organizations. We're going to talk about the IPO model of teams, inputs, processes, and outputs. So this is very similar, and you'll see as I go through it too, the concept of like antecedents and outcomes. And basically, it's just a way of looking at kind of predictors and outcomes at a team level, but it has very specific elements to it. So this input process output or IPO model is basically just an idea that team effectiveness is predicted by inputs, which result in processes that ultimately result in the outcomes. So it's kind of a three-step model. So the output is effectiveness, which is the same thing as kind of like team performance. And then the inputs are the things that you put into the team. Processes are things that occur within the team, and then outputs. And it's unique to teams because, at the individual level, we might have internal processes, we might have cognition and things like that, but it's not really quite as noticeable as processes in teams because you have to coordinate so many different people rather than just one person doing something. So we want to include this idea of a process in our models when we look at team effectiveness because you have to account for all of the different moving parts. So this is what we call a mediation model, where processes mediate the relationship between inputs and effectiveness output. Mediators are considered variables that explain a relationship. So if you're looking for the relationship between variable X and variable Y, a mediator explains it such that the X variable leads to the mediator, which leads to the Y variable. So you can see it's step one, step two, step three, like that. On the other hand, another type of variable we've talked about in the past are moderators, which don't explain a relationship, but rather affect it. So remember, I talked about moderators in a previous lecture, and I explained how moderators usually will change either the strength or direction of a relationship. Usually or often, mediators and moderators are kind of learned about together, but they're very different. Moderators will affect a relationship. They're kind of an interaction. Mediators explain a relationship. They're kind of a pathway. So to look at some examples of this, we can look at this mediation example where math ability might predict interest in the math major, but might also predict math self-efficacy, which is the mediator, which then also predicts interest in the math major. So this example right here, which is just a random school example, is called a partial mediation model. And a partial mediation means that the mediator, this math self-efficacy, partially explains the relationship between math ability and interest in the major, but those two variables also have a relationship even without the mediator. So a partial mediation means that X predicts Y, but is also predicted by the mediator. But a full mediation relationship would exist when that 0.33 there at the bottom, relationship between ability and interest, does not exist. So full mediation is when the only relationship that exists between variable X and Y is through the mediator. Most mediations are partial mediations where there's a relationship already, but we can explain more of it through a third variable. But there are definitely some full mediation models as well. And just for comparison, let's go back to look at that example of a moderator where this is the way it's modeled. It's kind of like the moderator is kind of pointing at the relationship between X and Y. And you'll see how they might affect strength or direction. So social support might moderate stress and well-being such that with more social support, the relationship is not quite as strong. You're able to maybe have better well-being in spite of the stress. So hopefully you understand the difference between those two, mediators and moderators. I encourage you to kind of just look at them a little more and maybe think of some mediators or moderators of your own. So now that we've talked about what the IPO model is, which is a mediator model, we can talk about what are some inputs, processes, and outputs in teams. For inputs, we have things like organizational context, which include reward systems, the managers, resources, the climate and culture of the broader organization, etc. So just the situation that your team exists in the organization. Two is your team task. So what kind of tasks are the team involved in, and how interdependent are these tasks? What are the characteristics of the job they're trying to do? etc. These things are inputs that go into the team. It's good for tasks to be meaningful, interesting, and provide some degree of autonomy. A third input is composition, which refers to the attributes of the team members. So, things like their skills, abilities, and experiences, those KSAOs we talked about. So these basically refer to the things that the individual members bring into the team. And they could be listed as any number of similar to the things we talked about at the individual level. So these are kind of individual level variables that contribute to what goes on in a team. One thing that's good to know of team inputs, specifically their composition, their characteristics, comes from a meta-analysis. And just for a quick refresher, a meta-analysis, again, is a study that compiles several other studies. So basically, someone put together a whole bunch of studies on team performance and looked at what predicts it. So basically, if you look at this table here, you can see that on the left-hand column, there's a list of composition characteristics, and these composition characteristics were tested in both lab and field studies. Lab studies being, of course, controlled studies that researchers bring people into to do the study, and field studies are occurring in the actual real-world environment. So you might go into an organization and study a real team. So looking at all the studies, including both, they found what the R is. And the R is Pearson's R, which is just the correlation. Remember, it can be between -1 and 1. So if you want to look at these numbers, I encourage you to kind of take a look, see what's going on, make some ideas about what you think is happening here, because it's interesting to see where the stronger and weaker relationships are. I also do want to point out to you guys, if you're not familiar with reading these types of study results, then you should know that the asterisk there refers to a statistically significant relationship. And I believe we've talked about this briefly. I haven't gone into a ton of detail about how to run analyses and statistical significance, but basically, sometimes you might find something that looks like it's a result, but the reality is that it just came out that way due to chance. And you wouldn't be too surprised to see that a lot of the ones that don't have asterisks are the really, really low numbers. But you can't count only on whether the number is high or low, because sometimes something might look strong, but it's not, and it might look weak, but it's still significant. So paying attention to that is important, because those are the relationships that are actually meaningful and you would expect to find again in other settings. Now, none of these relationships are very, very strong, which is pretty normal in social sciences and psychology especially. I would say relationships between the 0.2 to 0.4 are very, very common and strong by our standards. Anything under 0.2, so like those agreeableness one, that's a 0.1 or less, those are pretty small by some standards, but we still look at them because they're significant. We'd still think, yeah, this matters, because if you think about it, this is from studies that included thousands and thousands and thousands of people, most likely, as meta-analyses tend to do. And so if you look at that over the broad, huge course of all of these giant organizations with all of these people, that's still going to have an impact. So definitely there's nothing to sneeze at. So I say that just to let you guys know kind of some context of what it looks like when you're examining real world data and when you're examining an empirical study. So you want to know how to look at a table. But those are the main things you want to be paying attention to. One thing I noticed right off the bat with this is the field studies have stronger effects than the lab studies do. And usually we see the opposite in a lot of research. Lab studies have stronger effects than field studies, mainly because lab studies are incredibly controlled and we're able to really isolate the effects that we want, and we're able to really push them too. So we want to make a strong effect happen. We really control the environment to make it happen. But with teams research, sometimes it might make sense that the field studies are stronger. Why do you think that is? Well, if you think about it a little bit more, think about what you're doing in these studies. You're looking at teams and what predicts their performance. Who are your teams in a lab study? Probably just a group of students who are come in for credit, only spend maybe an hour in the study of conducting some tasks together. Real teams spend a lot of time together. There's enough time for them to build rapport. There's enough time for these composition variables to really have an effect. There's more things that they can affect. So in some ways, it's kind of is logical that field studies would have a stronger effect, because these teams, they work together more. There's more opportunity for these things to shine, and there's more important outcomes. They actually probably care more about the outcomes than the lab studies participants do. So it is really nice to see that result. But as you can see, there is an effect of this particular input of team composition and outputs. Now, whether or not we measure these inputs at an individual group or group level and how we do that is a totally other topic that you would talk about if you're getting more into statistics of it all. But I'm just going to leave that as it is for now. So another team input to think about is diversity. So we've talked about this before, the difference between the surface level or demographic diversity and the psychological deep level diversity. A lot of times the assumption is that diversity is a good thing, that diversity brings positive outcomes to the table, specifically things like creativity and innovation, solving problems, knowledge sharing, and having multiple perspectives. And of course, those things have been found, but most of the support comes from studies that concentrate on functional differences. So things like skills, information, and expertise. And more than that, if I move forward, if you look really closely at research on diversity and you look at all the research that's out there, there's not a lot of consistency. It's hard to say for sure that diversity leads to group performance. And you can imagine why those reasons might be. I would say it's just too broad. It's not specific enough. We have to define what we're looking at whenever we do research, and diversity just means we're different, but we need to know how we're different. And if we don't explain that how, then we're not really saying anything meaningful anyway, so it's not surprising that there's no consistency in that research. There is some research that says surface level diversity, so just demographic differences, have weaker effects on performance than deep level diversity, which should also make sense to you guys. I don't expect that being of different genders or different races or ages really should matter too much on whether or not you can perform. But having different skills, expertise, knowledge, values, these things would definitely influence your performance a lot more. And we don't really see a lot of correlation between the surface level and the deep level diversity, which is surprising to me because I would expect that things like your culture and your ethnicity and your differences in those areas could kind of be not necessarily that they cause deep level differences, but if you have different demographic characteristics, you're going to have different experiences throughout your life, which could lead to differences in those deep level things. But we don't really see that that's the case. Those demographic characteristics don't tend to matter that much. And I think that is actually pretty important to note. Ultimately, diversity of both deep and surface level are inevitable. So it's definitely important to research this more carefully and more specifically and know what's going on and what actually works and what doesn't. But I think that blanket statements about diversity and performance, you need to be more specific. It's way too broad to look at it that way, and that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to you guys. That's a citation if you're interested in reading another article about this topic. So we talked about inputs, that first kind of antecedent. What is our mediator? Team processes, things that occur in teams that don't really occur at the individual level. The first one is communication and coordination. So what you want to do with teams is minimize what's known as coordination loss, which is when team members don't synchronize well, they don't coordinate their work. So you do this through improving communication within the team. It's also important to maintain a high level of accountability. Using communication and coordination can do this. And this is important because it prevents what's known as social loafing. If you have taken a social psychology class, you've likely heard this term before. If you have not, just to refresh your memory, social loafing is when one member of a group doesn't really exert as much effort in their work as they would if they were doing it by themselves. Of course, this is kind of like I expect everyone else to pick up the slack for me type of mentality. One researcher suggests to reduce social loafing with a few methods. One is to increase the difficulty of the task. The harder the task is, the more every worker wants to pitch in. If you can't do that, increase the uniqueness of individual contributions. So make sure everyone brings something to the table that no one else has. Also make sure that your workers, your team members, they believe that attaining the goal that they want or the collective good depends largely on their own contributions. Let everyone think that their abilities and contributions to the team really matter. And in a similar vein, you also communicate directly to the team members that their unique contributions are important and necessary as well. Another thing related to communication and coordination is this concept of the shared mental model. It's a common term used in teams research, which is basically just an organized way for team members to think about how the team will work. It's basically, in layman's term, being on the same page. And you can use a lot of strategies to build and support shared mental models. So that is that. Another really popular team process is team cohesion, which is the degree of member integration or bonding in which members share a strong commitment to one another and or the purpose of the team. Cohesion is one of the strongest predictors of team performance. So the team needs to be together, they need to be a cohesive unit, they're bonded, they're embedded, they're committed, and they probably work well together and are on the same page. So it's related to the things I talked about previously, but it is its own construct. It's a broader construct as well. And on the flip side of that, we have team conflict, which is the degree of expressed disagreement amongst team members. Sometimes they're kind of seen as opposites of each other, but it is important to kind of analyze them differently because they're pretty broad and they have a little bit of different predictors and outcomes. You might ask yourself, is team conflict always a bad thing? Well, that kind of gets at a number of other questions we have to look into. We know that there's a difference between relationship conflict and task conflict, which are, relationship conflict means you have issues with the other team members personally. Task conflict means you're having issues over a particular task or, thing that has to be done for the team. And we found that the importance of relationship conflict or task conflict varies depending on the work team. So we may be seeing, and I don't really need to get too much into this, but we may be seeing that the relationship between conflict and outcomes, specifically performance, varies depending on the type of conflict, where it's existing, and in some cases we might even think a little bit of conflict in the right area can actually ultimately lead to some good. But the specifics of where that exists are still hard to find, that spot. But definitely I encourage you guys to think about where you might be able to get some positives out of conflict, maybe some growth, some new ideas that never existed before. So I would probably say that relationship conflict probably isn't usually going to be good, but in some cultures, relationship conflict doesn't affect the team at all. So it just really depends a lot. Another process is decision making. And decision making in teams is one where those other processes, cohesion and conflict and such, can come into play. There are some fatal mistakes that a lot of teams and groups tend to make when it comes to decision making. One is groupthink, which again, we're doing a little refresher from social psych if you've taken it. Groupthink is a tendency for people deeply involved in a group. They want to maintain group agreement. They want to maintain the status quo. They want to maintain their status as a member of the group and not stand out, not be different, not look like they're causing any issues in the group. Oftentimes it's where that in-group, that value you get from your in-group is just so strong that you don't ever want to put it at risk. And you'd rather appease everyone and keep the group together. So you never see anyone have any discourse. They never suggest different courses of action. It's not really a good place to be, especially when it comes to innovative teams. And it can really lead to dangerous situations where no one wants to speak up about an issue. Another similar but different situation is group polarization, which is that groups make their decisions and their opinions and feelings become more extreme because of they're in a group rather than as individuals. A very tame example of this would be something like if you were trying to decide what movie to watch with your friends, which you can't really do right now unless you do it virtually. So let's say you're on your Netflix online with a bunch of friends that you're chatting with, or with your family at home, or whatever it may be, and you're trying to decide what you want to watch. And you suggest, hey, let's watch the first Lord of the Rings movie. I think I might want to watch that one. What about that? And your, friend one says, oh, I love the Lord of the Rings series. It's one of my favorites. We should definitely watch that one. And friend two says, oh man, that series was like so well done. Everybody loved it. It got Academy Awards, yada, yada, yada. It's so great. And then you're like, yeah, it's the greatest movie ever. I want to watch it so bad. Let's watch that movie. And everyone's in agreement. Well, if you'll notice, your first comment of, hey, maybe we should watch Lord of the Rings, I kind of want to watch it, changes a lot from, oh man, I really want to watch it. And once you go around the room and everybody contributes a reason to why that's a great decision. So that's what we call polarization. As time goes on and as you bounce off back and forth with each other, nobody's really bouncing off different ideas. You're all just building on the same one, enhancing it more and more. So this is, not really a big deal when it comes to choosing a movie to watch, but in certain situations, it is a bad problem because of this risky shift phenomenon, where groups may tend to make more risky decisions than individuals because you're all hyping each other up, pushing each other to a more extreme a viewpoint. So in order to avoid these specific issues, it's important for team members to encourage hearing multiple ideas and opinions and weighing the options equally before making a decision. There's this term, psychological safety. Something like that would be critical in groups. You want people to have roles assigned where they are encouraged to play the devil's advocate, to give alternative suggestions. And of course, types of teams and groups make a difference in this. Sometimes certain situations require no disagreement, more like military hierarchical structure. But those situations also wouldn't have these problems because you would only still have one person making decisions, more like an individual rather than a team. So when it comes to your average team where everyone kind of has an equal role in it, which is very common in the modern era, especially due to the focus on innovation, you definitely want to encourage people to feel safe speaking up and speak up as often as possible for alternative options. Finally, we're at team outcomes, which is pretty much just these three things on the side. Team performance, which, is the same thing as individual performance, but at the same level. Did they meet the goal? What's the goal? What is the criteria of team performance? Team innovation is another common one, as I mentioned. The world is shifting towards a focus on innovation, and especially through the use of teams. And also team member well-being, which is all that stuff we've been talking about the past few weeks on stress and motivation and all of these topics that you might be interested in, but at the team level. So that does it for the second part of our teams lecture. Tune in at the next video for part 3, which will be the last part we have for the rest of the semester.